Does the mind need a body? How inactivism tries to explain where meaning comes from. Do you remember learning how to ride a bike? Chances are no one gave you a manual. More likely, someone just plopped you on a bike and gave you a push. You wobbled and you overcorrected, and maybe you hit the front brakes a little too hard and flew over the handlebars. But pretty soon, your body figured it out. You found your balance. You synced up with the bike. And now, if you've done it enough, you don't have to think about how to ride a bike, you just ride it. It's tempting to think that some things we do, like riding a bike, require having a body, while other things, like doing math in your head, don't. Maybe those could happen even if you were a brain in a vat. But some philosophers and scientists say, hold on, not so fast. They argue that every mental act, from balancing on a bike to solving math problems, happens in a loop. Brain, body, and world all working together. This view is called inactivism. It doesn't claim the mind lives entirely out there in the world or entirely inside your skull. It says the brain doesn't do it alone. That might sound strange. It is a shift from the more familiar view of the brain as a kind of information processor, like the brain is a computer metaphor we are all too used to hearing. So, is this view a genuinely new way to understand the mind? Or is it just reminding us of something we already knew, that the brain's activity is always tangled up with the body and the world around it? To find out, let's ask 4 questions. 1. What is inactivism? 2. Why might someone agree with it? 3. What do the critics say? And 4. Does artificial intelligence need a body? But before we begin, just a few notes. Where we are in the series. This is Essay 6 in the Trouble with Meaning series. You don't need to read the earlier essays to follow this one, but here's what we've covered so far. Essay 1, Searle's Chinese Room. Can a system understand meaning just by following rules? Essay 2, Symbolic Communication. How do symbols work, and what would it take to share them with aliens? Essay 3, The Grounding Problem. How do words or thoughts get their meaning in the first place? Essay 4, The Rise and Trouble of Representationalism. Why many scientists think the brain represents the world, and why that view runs into trouble. Essay 5, Teleosemantics. One of the major theories that tries to explain where meaning comes from. And this week, it's inactivism, one of the other major theories that tries to explain where meaning comes from. A quick note about words. Talk long enough about brains and sooner or later, someone will drop mind, cognition, or consciousness, often as if they were perfect synonyms. Philosophers, meanwhile, build entire theories on the hair-splitting differences between these words. So, these words come with philosophical baggage. In this essay, in an attempt to try to avoid some of that baggage, I'm going to use the phrase mental activity as a broad label for things like perceiving, remembering, imagining, or planning. No term is baggage-free, of course, but by flagging this early, I hope it might keep us from unpacking dictionaries in every paragraph. I'll revisit whether this label really earns its keep at the end of the essay. Question 1. What is inactivism? Inactivism is a relatively new word in the philosophy of mind. It started to gain traction in the early 1990s with the publication of a book called The Embodied Mind. In that book, the authors made a bold claim. Minds aren't things we have, they're things we do. To have a mind, they said, is to engage in sense-making, not by sitting back and receiving information, but by moving through the world, by acting, feeling, and responding. Since then, the idea has caught on. And while different versions of inactivism have taken shape over the years, most of them come back to 4 central claims. 1. The mind is embodied. For inactivism, The body doesn't just come along for the ride. It matters deeply. Mental activity, whether you're remembering something, imagining a scene, or thinking through a problem, isn't just happening in your brain. It's shaped by our body's movements, its sensations and rhythms. Our posture, our heart rate, the tension in our muscles, even signals from our gut, all of it can influence how we think. The body, in other words, isn't just a delivery system for the brain. It's part of the process. 2. The mind is embedded. We don't think in a vacuum. We think in kitchens and parks and waiting rooms. Our thoughts are shaped by what's around us. The objects we use, the routines we follow, the people we talk to. Even the feel of a place can change the way we think. You've probably noticed this. Some tasks just feel easier in certain settings. If you're trying to solve a problem, you might go for a walk or take a drive or hop in the shower because you know that's where your best ideas tend to show up. 3. Perception is active. If you've ever seen a textbook diagram of how the mind works, it probably looks like this. Input goes through the senses, gets processed in the brain, and then an output comes out, like pressing buttons on a machine. But inactivism rejects this picture. For them, there is no middle stage. Perception isn't something that happens after input and before action. It is action. It's skilled, moment-to-moment engagement with the world. 4. Inactivism is skeptical of mental representations. Inactivism doesn't deny that the brain does complex things, but they do question whether those things are best described as internal representations, the kind you find in the brain as computer versions of cognitive science. Radical inactivism argue that we don't need representations at all. Others take a softer view. They're open to the idea that some representations might exist, perhaps lean, action-oriented ones. Most camps agree on this point. If representations are part of the story, they show up later in both evolution and development. They emerge through culture, through language, and through shared perspectives. And they're built on top of something more fundamental, our embodied, active engagement with the world. Question 2. Why might someone agree with inactivism? Let's look at 4 reasons why someone might find inactivism appealing. 1. The grounding problem. We talked about this back in Essay 3. The grounding problem asks the question, how does mental activity get its meaning? Radical inactivism responds by rejecting the idea that meaning has to be explained in terms of internal representations in the first place. For them, meaning isn't something added on top of experience. It's already there in our ongoing engagement with the world. Moderate inactivism take a similar line, but leave some room for representations. They argue that if representations show up, they only make sense because they're grounded in embodied action. Our actions are already meaningfully tied to the world, they say. So any representation that develops out of those actions inherits that connection. 2. Behavioural evidence. There's a well-known experiment you may have seen. A group of people passing a basketball. You're asked to count the number of passes between players wearing white t-shirts. Halfway through the clip, a person in a gorilla suit walks right into the scene, beats their chest, and strolls off. And yet, most people don't notice the gorilla at all. It's one of the most famous examples of inattentional blindness. The idea that we can miss something obvious simply because we weren't looking for it. Change blindness tells a similar story. In one ad by Skoda, the car company, tiny details in the scene are constantly changing. A wall swaps colour, a teapot appears, and most viewers don't catch a thing. I've included a few examples in the article for you to check out. Experiments like these suggest that perception isn't a passive recording of the world. You don't take in everything and then process it. You won't notice the gorilla unless you are actively looking for it. And in change blindness, you won't see the change unless you are actively looking at the right spot. One of the most striking demonstrations of action's role in perception comes from a now famous experiment with kittens. It was the 1960s. Psychologists set up a kind of carousel for cats. Each pair of kittens was harnessed into the same rotating rig. One kitten was a walker and the other was a passenger. The walker kitten could walk with the carousel. The passenger kitten, though, just went along for the ride, carried in a little basket, seeing everything but not moving its legs. Importantly, both kittens received identical visual input, but only one could move. So what happened to the kittens? The walker kittens developed normal vision, but the passenger kittens, the ones who only watched, didn't. They walked straight towards what looked like a cliff, showing no hesitation. They had no depth cues. Enactivism takes this as powerful evidence. Perception requires active interaction with the world. 3. Neuroscience evidence. The brain doesn't come with fully wired circuits. As babies, our circuits have to be built. And it turns out, movement plays a key role in how that happens. In newborn rats, and even in premature human babies, early brain development involves something called spindle bursts. These are brief bursts of brain activity that show up right around the time of spontaneous body twitches. If you've ever felt your body twitch just as you were falling asleep, you've felt a version of this. In adults, spindle bursts mostly show up during non-REM sleep, but in babies, they happen all the time. The baby kicks or flinches, and at the same time or just before, a spindle burst is seen in the brain. These little jolts help wire up circuits, linking neurons that fire together. Some parts of the body work in opposition, like biceps and triceps. When one muscle contracts, the other one relaxes. So the brain learns not just what fires together, but what doesn't. So inhibitory patterns form too, which helps shape coordination. We see spindle bursts in the visual system too. Babies' eyes twitch even before they can focus, and those twitches help organize the visual cortex. In other words, the brain doesn't just wait for the world to feed it information. From the beginning, it's building itself through action. 4. Evidence from robotics. Back in the 1990s, roboticist Rodney Brooks had an idea that went against the mainstream view at the time. Instead of programming his robots with detailed maps of its world, carefully constructed layouts with predefined plans, he gave them simple rules, just enough to sense the world and react to it. These robots didn't have anything you'd normally call a representation, no internal model of their environment. But they could navigate. They could avoid obstacles. They could complete tasks. And, surprisingly, they often outperformed the robots with maps. Brooks called them robots without representation. He claimed intelligent behaviour doesn't require internal representations at all. It can emerge from tight, real-time loops between sensing and acting, which is exactly what enactivists were saying about living systems. Question 3. What do the critics say? Of course, not everyone is on board with enactivism. Let's review 3 of the most common criticisms. 1. Inactivism is vague about representations. One of the most common critiques of inactivism is that it's fuzzy on where it stands with mental representations. Even the more radical versions are hard to pin down. Take the book Radicalizing Inactivism. Early on, the authors come out swinging. They argue that mental activity doesn't involve internal contentful representations at all. No representations, full stop. But just a few pages later, they write that even radical inactivists need not and should not deny the existence and importance of contentful and representational-based models of thinking. Wait, what? To many readers, that sounds contradictory. The authors try to clear it up by drawing a distinction. They say there are two kinds of mental activity. Basic cognition, like perception, attention, and motor control, which doesn't require representations. It's grounded in our ongoing bodily engagement with the world. But content involving cognition, like imagining a future vacation or solving a math problem, does involve representations. The important point, they say, is that those content-involving representations are only possible because they're built on a foundation of non-representational activity, things built through brain-body-world interaction. This might sound like a clever move, but not everyone is convinced. Critics point out that this hybrid model might inherit the worst of both worlds. It doesn't fully reject representations, so it doesn't escape the same problems inactivism set out to solve. But it also adds a new problem. How does the system bootstrap itself from non-representational activity to content-involving representations? And right now, the explanations that are given, well, they sound a little hand-wavy, like saying, and then a miracle occurs. In trying to keep a foot in both camps, the hybrid view risks pleasing no one, too representational for radical inactivists and too vague for the representationalists. 2. Representationalism works in neuroscience. Some argue, why do we need a different theory? Representation works great in neuroscience. It explains the data, makes predictions, and helps us build models of how the brain works. Isn't that what a good scientific theory is supposed to do? Modern neuroscience often describes the brain as an information processor. Neurons are said to encode things like edges, faces, or places. Brain regions get mapped according to what they represent. These ideas are grounded in decades of experimental work. So, when radical inactivists say we should throw out the idea of mental representations, many neuroscientists raise an eyebrow. Are we really supposed to ignore all that data? Inactivists say not exactly. They argue they're not denying that brain activity correlates with experience. What they're questioning is how we interpret those correlations. Instead of thinking of brain activity as a kind of internal map, like a stored map in the head, they see it as part of a living, dynamic system, a system that only makes sense when you look at the whole loop, brain, body, and world, all acting together. To some, that can sound a little vague, like replacing one metaphor with another metaphor. But there is a growing pile of papers trying to make inactivism mathematically precise. The worry is, the more detailed these models become, the more they start to sound like the very representational theories they claim to oppose, just with new jargon. 3. Inactivism is just behaviorism. Inactivism wants to downplay internal representations. It says mental activity is rooted in action. in how organisms engage with the world. That focus on action sounds familiar. In fact, it sounds a lot like behaviorism, the dominant view of the mid-20th century. And that raises a question. If we strip mental activity down to nothing but action, aren't we just back where we started? Inactivists say no. They've tried hard to draw a clear line between their view and behaviorism. Behaviorism was about inputs and outputs, what goes in and what comes out. It didn't care what was happening in between. Inactivism, by contrast, is about the ongoing relationship, the loop between an organism and its environment. For sense-making, they claim, a system has to be autonomous. It has to regulate and maintain itself. And it has to be adaptive, not just reacting, but adjusting its responses in ways that serve its continued existence. These features, they argue, are absent in purely behavioral things like thermostats or bacteria that drift towards sugar. Question 4. What about artificial intelligence? If large language models can answer your questions, write a poem, and debug your code, isn't that mental activity? And yet LLMs don't move, they don't have bodies. Doesn't that suggest it's internal representations, not embodiment, doing the real work? Some, like neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, argue there is a crucial difference we should not overlook. Biological creatures have to meet their own thermodynamic requirements. To survive, biological creatures don't just have to perform useful behaviors, they also have to keep themselves alive. That means finding energy, repairing damage, maintaining internal order. If they fail to do either, act adaptively or maintain themselves, they cease to exist. But LLMs are different. An LLM does not have to secure its own energy, repair itself, or maintain its own internal order. We do those things for it. The two roles that are together in a biological creature, performing useful behaviors and keeping itself alive, are separate in an LLM. And some think that separation might not be a trivial detail. It could turn out to be a very important difference. So what if we gave an LLM a body? One that could interact with the world, one that could monitor itself, regulate its internal state, manage its own energy use, and adjust its behavior accordingly. Would that kind of interacting, self-maintaining, body-in-the-world system make a difference to the LLM? Would we expect to see something very different than we typically see from an LLM? The trouble with questions like these about whether AI needs a body to have mental activity is that the answer might depend on what we mean by mental activity. Embodiment might really matter for our kind of mental activity, but is it a universal ingredient required for any system to have mental activity? Large language models show that representation-heavy algorithms can at least mimic some high-level behaviors, but inactivists reply that until a system regulates its own survival in a messy world, calling it a fully fledged mind might be premature. The sum up and next week. In the last essay, we covered teleosemantics. Both teleosemantics and inactivism want to avoid magical or mysterious accounts of meaning, but they do it differently. Inactivism says meaning doesn't come from internal representations in the brain. It comes from active embodied engagement with the world. Teleosemantics says mental representations do exist, and they get their meaning from evolutionary history. In some corners of philosophy and cognitive science, This difference gets framed as a showdown. Representations versus inactivism. Pick a side. But many researchers think that's the wrong way to see it. The split isn't as clean or as necessary as it's sometimes made out to be. Next week, I'll wrap up this series on the trouble with meaning by tying up a few loose ends, including a look at where some thinkers believe the real trouble with meaning might lie.